Hello, everyone, and welcome to this evening's live stream. Let me move the intern here who has decided to. Actually, do you want to come say hello, Duke? This is Duke, who is currently staying with us for a little while. He may wind up back in the stream tonight as he likes to come up onto my desk while I'm here working for pets and lap time. So, but let me set him down for now. There you go, buddy. All right. Then tonight is a conversation that continues our discussion of. Oh, there he is again. Tonight continues the conversation about permaculture design. You're gonna rub the mic, buddy? Hold on. Let me. All right. Tonight continues the conversation about permaculture design as it relates to a needs and yields assessment. Something that you'll popularly find in a lot of permaculture literature is this idea to take a bit of time to research what it is we're going to be working with and on in our system and figure out what it's going to need if we want to include it, what we can do in order to support whatever that item is, and then to figure out what it's going to give back to the system. And then by doing so, as we start with one plant or one animal and build up our understanding of what all of those needs and yields are, we can see where the overlaps are to create guilds and a series of relationships within our design as we look at all the different ways that these items and ideas connect. And I think about Bill, as I put together the episode for next week, on Bill Mollison's attitudinal principles of permaculture. And one that he provides is the idea that the yields of a system are functionally unlimited. And part of that comes from the way that all of our elements within a system are related to each other. Because when we start discussing yields, it's about how those yields are useful within and across numerous items within our system. And so that we can think of every plant as a different element, every animal as an element, and then look at the relationships between those. And there's this idea that comes from systems theory and network theory, which I'll be sharing some more on next week, which looks at how, if you have one point, then there are no connections. Well, we can have one, perhaps it loops back to itself. But if we have two, then they connect to themselves and to each other, then that's three. If we have three, this becomes six different connections and so on, and continues to grow and grow and build and build. And so, nothing. That was nothing. And so that's where something like a needs and yields assessment becomes really important, is because that can help us to see a lot of that. And that as permaculture practitioners, as we're looking for the ways to increase what comes from a system, that looking at those yields is super important for that. And is where, when we start talking about like the human and the other than human, this stuff really starts to come together, and why we get into how even though a non-monocropped or an integrated garden may not have as high of yields of any singular item that comes out of it, the number of yields on aggregate wind up becoming much greater than just what we might find with monocrops. But this idea of needs and yields assessment comes from the one that you'll see most often is perhaps the most popular or most famous picture in permaculture, the Permaculture Chicken. And if I remember right, this comes from Bill Mollison's Permaculture Designer's Manual. And if you look up, just search for Permaculture Chicken, you're going to find this pretty quickly. It really is just kind of everywhere. And it's what shows up when I think about a needs and yields assessment, because of what we see here, because of knowing what the intrinsic characteristics are for a chicken, its breed, its color, its climate tolerance, its specific behaviors. We can consider this when we look at other animals because of something like goats. Different breeds of goats have specific behaviors on what they tend to like to forage for. And so, if you want a goat that is going to help you get rid of like heavier woody material, that's going to be a specific breed of goat that is more likely to do that. If you want something that's going to be eating leaves or perhaps strip vegetation, that's going to be a different breed. And having that understanding when we go in can help us make a better selection about what we need for our given design. And that's where, whenever doing a needs and yields analysis, it's important to do some research ahead of time as we're starting to think about what we want to include, to know before we make our purchases and things, to know exactly what those needs are going to be. I think probably one of the most common mistakes that are made within permaculture is deciding what we want to do first and foremost without deciding why it works for our system. I have joked on many occasions that swales are the darkness that haunt my soul. Hugelkultur kind of falls into the same category at times, as do herb spirals. And really, what this is about is that a lot of times when someone publishes a book on a particular idea within permaculture, that the techniques that they're promoting become super popular and so people want to try them. They want to experiment. They want to see what this is going to be like. And so it becomes more important to, in that context, a lot of times for folks, because they want to try that technique rather than asking, does this really fit for my system? And that's where I find a need and yields assessment is important as we do this research, because we can see whether or not it does fit, or if another technique is going to provide more benefits to our system through the yields that it gives us. And so, yeah, when we go back to this picture of the permaculture chicken, we can see, what are the needs that this chicken has. Certain things that most any living creature is going to need is likely some kind of protection in the elements, whether that means that we have a plant that needs dry roots or wet roots, which can determine how we're going to plant it. Perhaps it needs a shade cloth during the hottest months. If we want to keep something like lettuce from bolting, needing to be concerned about what the temperatures are going to be. For our chickens, they need dust to bathe in order to keep away parasites and pesticides. Of course, water to drink, air to breathe, food, and because they are generally social animals, we want to keep a number of them around for us. And that's one of those things that, when I first started examining animals for a permaculture system, I didn't realize that sheep were super social animals. I'd seen references to people keeping small quantities of goats, and thought that you could do the same with sheep, but then in doing some research, it looks like most sheep need 4 to 6 in order to have a large enough social group to be healthy, and in order to keep some of their sheep-like qualities when it comes to forming a herd and hefting together and getting used to the land that they're going to be on. And that was something that, like I say, I didn't know until I started researching sheep. I was considering sheep in a system as grass growers or grass mowers, as a living mower within a system. And so was looking at like what was necessary. And then, of course, by doing this needs assessment and getting an idea of how many sheep could live on a certain amount of space, realized that with even a modest herd, they would not fit in the design criteria that I had available to me and the land that was there. And so, that's where, by doing this needs assessment, I kind of placed them out of my system. And, we also have then what are the products or yields of something that we have in our system. And so, with chickens, they're eggs, meat, feathers. They produce manure. They let out methane, CO2. But then we can also use them for their ability, why do we like chickens in a permaculture system, and why have chickens and chicken tractors become something prevalent within the conversation? Because we can use their scratching behavior in order to, bare soil and scratch up the dirt, and their foraging instincts to take insects out. and prey on those. And then as we work through something like this, this is just one example for a chicken, but we could then look at something like tomatoes that we might want to include in a garden. And then what does that tomato plant need? And in looking at that, knowing what its fertilizer requirements are, what other plants we can keep in rotation with it, what family of plants is it a part of, so that we can look at what else it may grow well with if we're looking at companion planting. We have not only the tomatoes themselves as the fruit from that plant, but we then have the seeds, which we can save and replant, which provide another benefit for us. If we look at it a little bit further, those seeds provide value for us then within our community. Hey, Duke. Here, let's step you off here. Do cat down again. Let me move, adjust. And then those seeds from those tomatoes can be something that we can trade. Knowing what variety of tomato we want to grow ahead of time gives us an idea of what the size of that tomato is going to be, how long it's going to take for those seeds to germinate, to mature. And so, as we do a needs and yields analysis of all the plants that we want to include in a garden, we can look at then what we want to grow throughout the year. We can look at what our particular climate is and how adapted the different plants that we want to grow are to our climate. If we're looking at trying to grow varieties that we can naturalize as much as possible to the area where we're living in, we can consider, the conversation that we had a few weeks ago about climate change and how that impacts permaculture, our design process as permaculture practitioners. We can be considering what plants will grow best as the climate that we're in changes over time. And so, what do we want to bring into our system that are likely to exist there as the climate where we are changes? And then that can, influence our overall design as we want to take things like disasters into account and design for those changes in the future. And so that's where, I really think that a needs and yields analysis, once we kind of have a general idea of what our base map looks like and what we're going to include, or what we would like to include in our system to do this needs and yields assessment, in order to find out what fits best for our needs. And then once we do a needs and yields analysis for, say, our zone 1 garden plants, any animals that we might want to put in, we can also use a needs and yields assessment for the garden itself and consider what the overall needs of that garden are. Consider what it is we're going to be planting and start looking at specifically how much water are we going to need. Are there plants that require more water than others? If we're concerned about a dry period in our growing season, what are the techniques or interventions we can put in place in order to make the best use of any water that we harvest? And so then what are our mulching techniques? And, what are the mulches that we might want to use? Because different mulches have different benefits for us and can change depending on what stage our garden is in, because of something like, if I'm really trying to suppress weeds, one of my favorite mulches is wood chips. And, generally here on the East Coast, because of the green spaces and tree trimming and things like that, it's really easy to get wood chips. And so, they work pretty well for paths for people who are do not have any mobility issues. But if I'm in a space that I don't have access to woody material, then maybe I'm going to be looking at a cover crop that I want to grow in order to create my own mulch for the growing season. Using wood chips, 12 inches of wood chips will suppress just about anything and kill it. But if you want water infiltration into something like a garden, then you need to be looking at, a few inches, 2, maybe 3, and checking it from time to time to make sure that it's not compacting. While at the same time, if you just need some ground cover and you're not worried about weeds, shredded newspapers work pretty well, or other shredded paper. I try to avoid printer paper because the toner tends to have some plasticizers and things in it, but those kinds of forecasts come out of this process of doing a needs and yields assessment. And it's, if I were, as I think about this and talk about it tonight, if I were to think about one thing from the permaculture design process that I would probably try to teach just about anybody interested in creating a better world, it would be this needs and yields assessment. And then, asking that question of, is this something that we actually will benefit from? Is it something that fits with what we're working on? Because once you start getting into, does it fit? And asking that kind of a question, it can be fairly illuminating pretty quickly whether or not something is going to work. And because we had the conversation before about, when it comes to our zone analysis, that, originally permaculture kind of just had a 1 through 5, but since has added a 0, 0, a 0, and a 6 to represent the self, the home, and the larger biosphere, respectively. I also think that a needs and yields assessment is really important for our work as permaculture practitioners in general, to do this for the self, for that zone 0, 0. And when we do that kind of a needs and yields assessment, I've heard it referred to as like a personal audit. But I really like this because it can help us get really clear about what we're going to need to achieve our goals. uh, you know, and when it comes to everything from like how much space do we need to for a garden, how much time are we really going to be able to put towards our practices, what is our level of engagement as permaculture practitioners based on the rest of our life. And there's no judgment in that. I'm fortunate that I've had the support that I have over the years to have done this in the fashion that I have full time for so long. And each of us bring different tools and techniques and ideas to the table when it comes to what our abilities are to engage in this way. And so, it took me a long time of trying to be a gardener to realize how much of a gardener I'm just not. As much as I wanted to be, I've made the joke over and over again that I have a black thumb, except for when it comes to children, strawberries, garlic, and cats. Herbs and pots, not my best thing. Though all my beer and wine has been okay, my kefir, it's taken a couple of generations of culture in order to keep that alive, yogurt, things like that. And so, being able to focus on what it is that we're individually really good at and what our overall personal needs are. And so being able to sit down and admit openly to where our strengths lie and saying, okay, if you are a good gardener, then what kind of food do you want to grow? What are your needs when it comes to growing food? What are your needs for space? Is that something that you can find where it is that you are living, or do you need to get a community garden spot, or do you need to lease land if you're looking at trying to grow all the food that you're going to eat, and grow 100% of your calories is going to be a completely different requirement from someone who is just trying to grow certain things that they can't find, perhaps because they're not available at local markets, or are unique to your diet, or just something that you enjoy growing, is a perfectly good reason too. I still think homegrown tomatoes, even if you get a start from somewhere, being able to tend to them on a balcony makes them one of the most delicious things that you can have. But it goes even deeper than just space for growing food. What are our social needs? And where does that determine where it is that we're going to live and to have access to those kinds of resources? I have friends and family who would like to be able to live off grid, far away from civilization, but because of health concerns and, various pre existing conditions, they can't live far away. And that certain communities don't provide the health care or health services that they will need, currently or as they age. We need to look at what our financial needs are and how does that relate to how we're going to support ourselves. And I think about when I was, first discovering permaculture and looking at, I was I initially was living with my parents at the time when I first discovered permaculture because I was home on summer break working at a Coast Guard facility. And then a few years later, started to dive back into it after 2000, 2001, and was living with a friend then. But, at that time, I could have lived in a tent or, for a long time, home was really just where I hung my hat. So could have, done a bunch of couch surfing and other things to meet my shelter needs. But today, as a husband, as a father, I have different housing requirements. Wanting because my children are different genders, so that they can have their own bedrooms and their own spaces, and being able to make decisions around that changes the requirements of what I'm looking for, which can change our financial needs as a family, and being pretty clear about that and knowing that as I've hey Duke as I have talked about myself before, having celiac disease and needing to be aware of those dietary requirements. Hey. I apologize for a Duke again, but being aware of that as well as part of that self-assessment. And as you kind of tally these things together, you can create a picture of what your complete needs are. And then when you start going through that and you have an idea of what you need in order to live and support your life, then what are the yields that you have? Having an idea of what your returns are from your occupation, and how, when you pair that up with the rest of your life and lifestyle, does that give you an excess to invest in these other things that you're interested in? Does that provide you the finances and time and space to take a permaculture design course if you want to? If you're looking at, skill building, and what kind of time you have available, then is that something where you want to go back to school? Is that where you can, be watching YouTube videos at night and tinkering, or going out into your backyard and practicing what it is that you've been learning? Being able to have a clear understanding of what we need and where our current yields are, and then knowing what we would want to meet our goals, we can build on ourselves and what our ability to meet those interests are, and go through and be able to figure out how to get there. I've really been turning around that space of the zone 00 and self-transformation and things like that, as I recently launched the next session of the Storytelling for Personal Transformation course, and in that process have really been thinking about this personal space as permaculture practitioners, and social and cultural permaculture, and how all of those kinds of things really start with us and the place that we're coming from, and that as we dig into that and have a better understanding, we can kind of work from the inside out. Looking over where we kind of went this evening, looking at the Permaculture Chicken and some other things, I realized how much I'm kind of personally in that space of personal growth and development and movement through the permaculture process. So yeah, if for those of you who are watching the stream, if you have any questions before I draw this to a close, I think I'm probably going to wind up revisiting this again sometime in the future as I turn this over. I'm thinking more fully about like demonstrating more deeply my personal needs and yields assessment as a way to dig into this, but also think about like working through that base map and that design. So, but if you have any questions, those of you who are with us, if you want to drop those into the chat, let me know. I'll take my short little break, take a drink, and then if nobody has any questions, we'll draw it to a close. But if you do, I'll go ahead and answer those while we're here. Duke, you want to come back? But, yeah. Okay, it doesn't look like we have any questions this evening. So thank you all for joining me. Yeah, this is one I think that I'll revisit, but I'd like to get some feedback on, see what folks thought. But from here, the next live stream will be next Wednesday, June 30th at 8 p.m., and that's going to be starting to dig into the principles of permaculture with Bill Mollison's 5 attitudinal principles, which come from the designer's manual. And then from there, we'll get into David Holmgren's principles of permaculture, which might take a little bit longer to talk our way through because of how popular those are and because there's 12 of them rather than 5. Next week will also be a look at like those principles as they relate, Bill's principles as they relate to children, because I like the way that he presents some of that information and just the kind of way that they've become these aphorisms or maxims that are in some ways a bit more presentable, I think, in the conversation with children. So, but yeah, I will catch Patreon folks. For those of you who are community members, if you're not, that's patreon.com/permaculturepodcast. Have a new weekly update out next week, as well as some other things in the works. And yeah, we will be back next week for the conversation on Bill Mollison's principles of permaculture.